Celia, Director of the Princeton Environmental Institute, and I want to welcome all of you back to our seminar series. I'll remind you that our next seminar, which is the last one for the fall semester, will be the first Tuesday of December, December 4th, and our speaker will be Eric Wood. I'll also remind you that if you haven't seen it, we have our 25th anniversary celebration exhibition over in Frisch Center. You're welcome to go have a look. And if you want even more, I'll remind you that we are co-sponsoring the exhibition in the Art Museum called Nature's Nation. It's a fantastic exhibition. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to do it. And as part of that, the next speaker associated with that entire exhibition will be Naomi Klein next week, Thursday the 15th. Also, for those of you, I saw a lot of you brought food in, that's fine, but please clean up after yourself, and anything left over carry out with you so we don't have to clean up after you. Thank you. All right, on to today's seminar. We're really happy to have Elke Weber as our speaker today. I'm sure you all know that Elke, by reading a screen or by knowing her, is the Andlinger Professor in Energy and Environment, part of the Andlinger Center, also Professor of Psychology and Public Affairs, and currently serves as Associate Director for Education in the Andlinger Center. Her research is really focused on the fascinating topic of how we make decisions, and in particular, appropriate for today's talk will be how we think about environmental decision making. I took a quote from something that she put together that I thought was really interesting in terms of the description, which is how do finite capacity information processors judge, decide, act, and live in a world that's only partially predictable. I think that pretty much captures what we're going to be hearing about today. Elke has a very distinguished record. She was a member of the U.S. EPA Science Advisory Board. She was a lead author for the IPCC 5th Assessment Report, Working Group 3, among a number of other activities. She has received the Distinguished Achievement Award from the Society for Risk Analysis. She's a fellow of the Society for Risk Analysis, a fellow of the Society for Experimental Psychology, and a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. Also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a member of the German National Academy of Sciences. So please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Elke Weber.
Thank you, Mike, for that kind introduction. And I'm really gratified to see so many familiar faces in the audience. Makes me realize I have arrived at Princeton at long last. Also thrilled to be on the other side of the podium because I've been to so many of these talks and they're always so interesting. So I hope I will do it justice. I probably have too much material, and because I want to give you an overview of not just what I'm doing right now, but also sort of how that connects with some of the things I've done in the past. But to set the stage, not really necessary here, but we do live in the Anthropocene, and we live in an era where our behavior, human behavior, especially with respect to energy consumption, the types of energy, the amount of energy, is affecting the environment. And the ruling assumption when it comes to how we decide how to act is one of rationality, economic rationality. Homo economicus is the decision maker in public and in corporate strategic analysis and planning. And the reason I'm here is because we are most of the time not necessarily dealing with Homo economicus. We're dealing with a different species. The different species is us, Homo sapiens. And that's not to say that we don't make rational decisions. It's a huge evolutionary accomplishment, to develop the prefrontal cortex that allows us to do that. We have the hardware. We have to program the software. We have to send our kids to college, to do things right in probability theory, in analysis. And so how do we make decisions instead? Well, we learn a lot better from personal experience, learning by getting hurt, social observation, imitation. We use associations, and in particular, a class of associations called emotions, to guide our behavior. Emotions are our early warning system. They tell us when things are good, approach. When things are scary, back off, protect yourself. And we have a whole bunch of goals. I'm going to get back to that. Oftentimes mutually conflicting goals. Sort of very few people in the world are trying to screw up our existence on planet Earth, but other goals get in the way. Yeah? And so the question is, how do we resolve the goal conflict? So here's a preview of what I'm going to do. I will talk about the existing behavioral landscape right now. In other words, what theory has come from psychology, from neighboring disciplines, to explain how Homo sapiens makes decisions in an atmosphere of uncertainty. My illustrations will be mostly with respect to climate change, because that is, in some sense, a perfect storm, sort of the existential crisis that we as a species will have to face one way or the other. I'll talk a little bit about a project I've been engaged with the Stockholm Resilience Centre. Simon Levin was kind enough to introduce me to Maya Schluter, who's leading it there, where we're trying to bring together the existing toolbox of behavioral theory to help people in conservation or in resource allocation contexts to model human decision making in ways that deviate a little or a lot from the rational model assumptions. And in the process, and in case you don't get to my takeaway, the takeaway really is that behavioral theory, behavioral decision theory is helpful in multiple ways. On the one hand, it will improve our predictions on how people, citizens, consumers will respond to a political or economic policy. It adds policy tools in its own right, oftentimes much cheaper economically or politically than the existing ones. And then lastly, it also helps us to improve the implementation of these existing policy tools. I won't have very much time today to get to this last part of sort of my talk, but I think you can sort of see it by implication as we go. Okay, so let's start with going beyond Homo economicus. And we'll start with the bad news, and then I'm going to segue to good news. So the bad news, if you think about sort of not assuming that all decisions are rational, is that it introduces a whole lot of additional uncertainty in how Homo sapiens is going to respond. The beauty about Homo economicus, we know exactly what he or she is going to do. And so what does that mean? Well, when we say deviations from rational choice, that happens at all levels. Of course, it's true for consumers, for voters. How people respond to energy efficiency, to electric car, to CCS, to other technology is a huge puzzle. It's not certainly far from rational. In general, our concern and our action with respect to climate change risk is puzzling. Most of the people in this room will agree it's a huge challenge, and yet we're sort of delegating it to the sidelines. It's number 16 or 17 on most people's list of things to worry about when you wake up in the middle of the night. But it's not just citizens and voters. It's also happening, decision-making that is far from rational in the private sector. When you look at the resource extraction, the question is what's going to happen to stranded assets, clean energy, technology, R&D. Venture capitalists follow fads. Institutional investors sort of don't necessarily put the right kind of bets on new technologies. And in general, financial sector perception and response to carbon risk is far from adequate, just as it is at the individual level. And then lastly, also, the public sector response, the international UN or the COP negotiations and treaties, national carbon pricing, or what's happening at the state and local policy level, again, oftentimes shows market deviations from what we expect by rational choice, by rational agents. There have been papers about that, and a very recent paper earlier this year in Nature Climate Change had a group of people from, I think, Connecticut look at the possible responses that people might have with respect to extreme weather events, and the kind of precautions, adaptation, mitigation responses they could take with respect to that. When you model that either by rational choice or by a broader set of behavioral models, you come to the conclusion in this paper that the uncertainty about what our climate will look like in 2100 that can be attributed to uncertainty about the human response is just as big as the uncertainty associated with the climate system. And so it's exactly the same magnitude. So definitely something worth addressing. Okay, let's go from the bad news to the good news. And here I want to argue that looking at Homo sapiens, and in particular at sort of two sources of abundance in Homo sapiens. One is a much broader set of goals that we bring to the table. Yeah, utility maximization clearly is important. Material goals matter, but we bring other goals as well. And also we bring a broader range of ways in which we process information, different decision modes to the table. And by considering those, first of all, again, I want to argue the takeaway is we can make better predictions about what will happen when you introduce a new policy, when a new external event, when a shock happens. And secondly, you might be able to modify people's responses because you know what the underlying mechanisms are. So it's a causal psychological process model that therefore also provides you with entry points for action. Mike already mentioned the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, where I was involved in a chapter on risk management in Working Group 3 on mitigation. And there we, for the first time, actually introduced the existence of non-rational judgment and choice processes into the IPCC framework. We made the argument that if you're trying to manage risk, climate uncertainty, you not only have to know what our rational tools are on the right-hand side, but you also have to know how the public, how other stakeholders will respond to the risk and to the uncertainty. And it's only in combination of those two pathways, the descriptive analysis and the normative analysis, that you can provide a useful and effective prescriptive analysis on how to go forward. It's reassuring that there has been some progress in the current sixth assessment report that's in progress right now. There actually is a standalone chapter in Working Group 3 on demand side and social aspects of mitigation. Okay, so let's take a step back. History is always good. So I want to give you a brief and somewhat selective history about what has happened in the space of modeling on a behavioral level, judgment and choice. The first part, Act 1, takes place in the 19th century. Then we move into the 20th century and talk about some follow-up from that. So let's start in the 19th century in a different Weber's law. I wished it was mine, but it's not. So this was Ernst Weber. This was the early days of psychology. Psychophysics is a process of mapping external stimulation, like, for example, the loudness of a tone, to internal percepts, the reported loudness of a tone. Ernst Weber basically sort of established that a just noticeable difference, how much do you have to crank up the volume before you say, oh, noticeably louder, is actually a constant in the sense that the degree in which you have to crank the volume up is a function of the starting point. If you start very low, you just have to crank a little bit before you say, oops, louder. But if the starting point already is pretty high, you have to crank up quite a bit before you say noticeably louder. Okay? So that suggests that valuation, in this case valuation of loudness, is a relative concept. It's not an absolute concept. Yeah? There's actually a joke that some of you have heard that I tell about James Thurber. He's an American humorist. He had published a new book. He also had recently gotten married, and the reporter said at the press conference, how do you like your new wife? And he said, compared to what? Now, it's funny because it's so true that almost any kind of judgment that we give, even about temperature, what's the temperature in this room? We don't know, but you can say, is it warmer or colder than it is outside? That's an easy judgment. Yeah? And in fact, neurons encode change. Neurons don't encode absolute value of something. Neurons do encode change because change oftentimes is important for evolutionary survival. Yeah? If things change, we have to pay attention. Yeah? Is it good? We want more. Is it bad? We back off. Well, of course, that was incorporated in very important ways into prospect theory that many of you actually have heard about, if only because Danny Kahneman, one of the architects, is still one of our own and taught in psychology in the Woodrow Wilson School for many years. We have the Kahneman Treatment Center on campus. But prospect theory basically is a band-aid on expected utility theory. That sort of says, well, yes, when it comes to gains, we do have diminishing marginal returns. But when it comes to losses, bad things also satiate. And because encoding is relative and not absolute, there is no absolute 0 point. And we always take some reference point, maybe the status quo, maybe some expectation that we have. But outcomes are encoded relative to this reference point. And that makes a difference. It makes a difference for two reasons. Our risk attitudes are different. In gains, we're risk averse, but for losses, we're risk seeking. And losses loom larger. Loss aversion sort of basically makes us deplore a loss of something twice as much as gaining the same amount makes us feel good. Okay. Now, does this have some relevance in the real world? So I just want to briefly show you a study that I did 15 years ago or so in Argentina with some collaborators in Argentina in the Pampas, where we looked at the value of information that farmers put on these seasonal to interannual climate predictions that were sort of coming on the market at the time. Of course, you can use those climate predictions and source signals because then you sort of can modify your agricultural practices, grow different types of corn, do different things in terms of irrigation. And there's a difference, of course, between owners and tenants of the farm because owners have a more long-term interest in their land. But when we modeled sort of the value that owners or tenants are to put on this ENSO signal, on the seasonal to interannual climate information they could be getting, the only thing that we really have in the rational model is risk aversion, okay? And we have initial wealth. The model made some predictions which didn't turn out to be very accurate when you actually asked farmers about how much they were willing to pay. Now, if you model the same behavior with prospect theory on the right-hand side, again, owners and tenants, but now you introduce a reference point, which in many cases was how much they made last year on their farms. And you also introduce a reasonable level of loss aversion. And now you look at the effect as a function of risk aversion and whether they're owners and farmers. The predictions of the model came pretty close to what people are actually willing to pay for it. Okay, let's get back to our history story. And so this is now Act 2. We're skipping 100 and some years, and we're now in the middle of the 20th century. Herb Simon, who actually was the original, I should also mention that Danny Kahneman, of course, got the Nobel Prize in Economic Science for his work on prospect theory in 2002. But Herb Simon was the first non-economist to get the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his work on bounded rationality in the 70s. And he basically sort of reminded us of the fact that we're dealing with Homo sapiens. And Homo sapiens has finite attention. We can only process so much less than is actually going on in the world. Finite attention, finite information processing capacity. And so since we have finite resources, we have to husband them carefully. We have to allocate them selectively and by important criteria. Query theory, of course, prospect theory was already one way in which we husband information capacity or attentional capacity by having a reference point. We don't have to know everything that's going on in the world. We just have to know what happened most recently, what happened last year, and are we trying to do better than that or less good than that? Query theory is a theory that I've developed with Eric Johnson, which is, in some sense, the lower level psychological process model that gives rise to the functional regularities that you see described in prospect theory. So it's not a rival to prospect theory, but it sort of provides you the psychological foundation of prospect theory. It's a theory that basically explains how we decide, how we have preferences. Do you want $50 right now? Are you willing to wait 3 months to get $75? Well, you think about what argues for option A, what argues for option B. If there are more arguments in one basket, you go with A, you go with B. But here's now where things become non-rational. It matters. We do these things actually sequentially because, going back to the previous slide, we are finite information processors, so we can only do one thing at a time. These ambiguous visual images, you can either see the candlestick if white is the foreground. You can see the two children looking at each other if black is the foreground. You can switch back and forth between them, but you can't really see them both at the same time. In the same way, query theory argues that we think about one option or the other option. We can go back and forth between them. But here's the important part. As you think about what's good about option A, the first one, you temporarily inhibit all arguments for all other choice alternatives because you first want to figure out, okay, what's good about the first one? Yeah? Then as you turn to the other ones, let's say the second one, because you just a split second ago, inhibited those arguments, they have a harder time coming to the surface. Okay? So all other things being equal, we generate more evidence for the first option we consider. And of course, that raises the $1 million question. What determines which option we look at first? Right? So it turns out there are many important answers to that question. The status quo is something we consider consider first, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it, right? If you've been doing something for a while, like driving on the right-hand side of the road, it makes sense to first think about why you're doing this. You know, you had some good reason to start with. Hasn't killed you yet, can't be all that risky. Yeah? And choice defaults, you know, that's some recommendation. In this country, we're not organ donors unless we declare otherwise. So we first think about what's good about not being an organ donor. In other countries, that's not the case. The example I want to show you also is that options that have greater surface appeal. That's presumably why we have advertising. Yeah, advertising is saying, here, look at me. I'm shiny. I'm red. Yeah, I'm attractive. And so a few years ago, I was puzzled by the fact that Americans hate taxes, in particular carbon taxes, and yet at the time the uptake of carbon offsets, which of course is just another carbon user fee that you pay, right, had been doubling sort of every year that these carbon offsets had been in existence. So the question was, are these different people who buy the offsets and hate the taxes, or is that just something about the label tax or the label offset, you know, that sort of triggers a different response, and that might be mediated by query theory? So we gave people a choice between 2 airline tickets. These are representative samples on the web in the United States, about a ticket, you know, just round trip Los Angeles, I think New York City, or one that includes a carbon user fee. And we had 2 pages of text about why the amount of the fee was what it was, how it was going to be used to offset the carbon that you're emitting because of your travel, and exactly identical information. The only thing different between half was a sample and the other half was the word carbon tax or carbon offset. And so we called the study a dirty word or dirty world. And also, yeah, sort of before people made the decision, this was online, we asked them to think out loud what went through their mind as they made this decision. And then they made their choice. And then we asked them for demographics, including political affiliation. As you can see, when the label was a carbon offset, it didn't matter who the respondents were. Across the board, 62% of respondents bought the inclusive ticket, basically bought the carbon user fee. It's very different when you say carbon tax. It doesn't matter for the Democrats. It matters a lot for the Republicans. You know, they don't like it. They switch away. And what you see when you look at people's arguments, what goes through your mind as you make this decision, you see that Republicans who see the word carbon tax immediately go to the other option. Yeah, anything but a tax. Yeah, and they process that one first. The early processing, the clustering of the early processing, in combination with the differences in arguments for one or the other, which of course is exactly what query theory predicts, completely mediates statistically these differences in choice. Yeah? One thing that we oftentimes do in this query theory studies, we say, okay, the proof is in the pudding. Yeah? Mediation is just statistical, right? But if it really is early processing of one option or the other one, why don't we tell people what to consider first? Yeah? And so we would basically tell Republicans who see the word carbon tax, tell us first about what's good about this inclusive option that includes a carbon tax. And by and large, in these studies, people follow instructions. And when people follow instructions, the differences in choices go away. In this case, about 40% of Republicans did not follow instructions. They did not do what the person in the white lab coat told them to do. Those who did follow instructions actually showed the effects. The difference went away. But those who didn't do it, did so because there's such a knee-jerk reaction to the word tax that you turn away attention. So labels matter. OK, bounded rationality and its implications. And so one implication, as we said, is because you have so little attention, so little processing capacity, you have to be selective. And what are the implications of selectivity? And this gets back to having so many goals. We do have material goals, but we also have psychological goals, feeling confident in our decisions, feeling that we make a difference in the world. We have other regarding preferences, both positive and negative ones. There's both altruism, there's Schadenfreude. And oftentimes they are in conflict. And so one thing that's true is that only a goal that's active at the time of decision influences your choice. And that's why oftentimes we look inconsistent, because one context elicits one set of goals, the other context elicits a different set of goals, and we therefore make responses, decisions that look sort of like they shouldn't be coming from the same person, because we're not weighting all the goals equally all the time. You see this in action a lot. So certainly culture affects our chronic activation of different types of goals. More collectivist countries put more weight on other regarding preferences and goals than individualist countries. But also we can activate different types of goals in a more transient fashion, which is of course what a lot of choice architecture does. And so it turns out that I hope you all have gone to vote, or you will go to vote. But if you go to vote in different locales, like for example in a church setting, as opposed to a school setting, we make decisions on certain topics in different ways, because the physical environment of where we cast our ballot just primes different subsets of values. We've done some sort of work, some of my former students at Columbia, on making decisions, for example, about buying green electricity for yourself, for your own household, either at your own kitchen table on a Friday afternoon, or as part of a pizza party in the town square, or a condo meeting. And again, it's the physical context of other people around you that primes collective goals, and you're more likely to buy the green electricity in the group setting as opposed to individual setting, even though it's in all cases just for yourself. Here's an example where selectivity might actually lead to negative consequences. And there's a whole literature on something that my collaborator Eric Johnson has called local warming. The fact when you ask people about their beliefs or about their concern, or even about their actions, including consequential actions on climate change, on global warming, they oftentimes are very much influenced in all of these dependent measures by how warm or cold it is on the day that you ask the question. In other words, how abnormal is the temperature in your current setting relative to what is expected on average. And as you can see here, both, it doesn't matter what you call it, global warming or climate change, whether you ask for belief or concern, the curves are upward sloping when the day of the question is much colder than average, than is much warmer than average. And so that basically suggests when you ask people the question about global warming, they say, okay, what evidence is at hand? And let me take the evidence that's closest in space and in time, which is like, how warm is it right now? It's a little bit like asking people about the American GDP, and they look in their wallets to see how much money they have, right? Yeah, maybe it's a tiny piece of evidence, but there's certainly a lot more evidence to be had here. Danny Kahneman talks about this as attribute substitution. We substitute an attribute that is diagnostic, but maybe hard to get or hard for us to process, with something that might not be nearly as diagnostic, but is a lot easier to get, is a lot more accessible. Yeah? And that's just like a natural thing that happens in the spur of the moment because we are finite information processors. Okay, here's the other source of abundance. So we talked about the abundance of goals and the fact that you can actually harness these other goals, and we'll come back to that some more in 5 minutes or so. But there's also an abundance of ways in which we make decisions. Yeah, I've sometimes called this decision modes, these qualitative different ways in which we arrive at a decision. And of course, the first one, the calculation-based mode, is the one that sort of underlies rational choice. Yeah, we might not do it rationally, we might do it the prospect theory way, but the bottom line is oftentimes we do think about costs and benefits, we do think about sort of probabilities and delays, and we make a decision accordingly. But other times, we go with our feelings. If it feels good, we approach, we want more. If it's scary, we back off. And yet a third class of models, of rules, have to do with sort of following a rule, oftentimes following a rule that comes from our role. Doctors, at the end of their study, swear the Hippocratic Oath that they will sort of look after anybody who's in need of medical attention, no matter how inconvenient it is. Parents sort of look after their kids. If they don't look after their kids, we take their kids away from them. There are consequences to not following these social rules. And norms, the perceived norms that are operating in a society, oftentimes encode these rules of conduct. Now, all of these decision modes, most of the time, operate in parallel. They're mediated by different structures in the brain. And most of the time, we're not even aware of the fact that we have these different voices in our heads. But there are situations where their output is not always aligned, where calculation might say, okay, I'm going to defect here. Yeah, I'm going to be rational. And your rule or role-based decision says, I shouldn't be doing that because a good citizen or a good Christian doesn't do that sort of thing. Yeah? And in those situations where the output, with a recommended course of action, is different for the different modes, that's when people sort of hesitate. They might be uncertain. They might be not very confident in their decision. They might actually go back and forth. We have post-traumatic stress because we sort of think maybe we should have done something else. And so there are implications for sort of these different processes in our head, both physical and psychological. So this brings us sort of to the topic of norms. There's actually a very nice study group that has been happening for a while. Actually, it was happening before I joined, but this goes across departments, political science, evolutionary biology, Woodrow Wilson psychology, that looks at sort of how and why norms work here at Princeton. And there are two types of norms. The descriptive norms, like knowing what is typically happening, and knowing what ought to be, what people should be doing, what we should be doing. And the slide just describes the different routes that we have, cognitive routes and motivational routes for why these norms make a difference. So sort of knowing what on average should be happening, the cognitive route is, well, you just imitate. You can safely do what everybody else is doing. And the motivational route is that, well, as I said, you can safely do what everybody else is doing. It can't be all that bad. Also, you might not want to stick out. And that's especially relevant in some cultures where sticking out, the head that sticks out gets chopped off. Injunctive norms, what we should be doing, oftentimes moral and ethical, religious rules of conduct. The cognitive route is telling us, sort of, we should do what the authority figure, God, the Pope, our professor is telling us, and the motivational route is telling us, so that sort of this, doing this, basically following the rule that denotes membership to a group makes us members of that group. And group membership is rewarding in its own right. We're social animals. We need to know who we belong to. We want to belong to groups. So what is the impact of social norms? Well, one thing that's nice about utilizing these norm-based, rule-based decision modes is that oftentimes people change their behavior without necessarily changing their attitudes. And that's nice because we know in some domains it's hard to change attitudes. And so if you can change behavior without that attitudinal push, that is great. Betsy Pollack and one of her students showed this for gay marriage. That's like a top-down signal, like the Supreme Court decision, actually changed what people thought the norms were, the norms with respect to gay couples in the country, and that changed their perception and stated behavioral intentions. And we recently, Sarah Constantino, one of my postdocs, has been doing this for climate change action, showing that sending an institutional signal about sort of the government or businesses or scientists caring about climate change, doing something about it, changes what people think ought to be happening with respect to that, and is happening with respect to that. So then the question is, can these changes in norms actually sort of be used to create cascades, sort of self-reinforcing virtual loops that create tipping points, for example, with respect to climate change or with respect to gay marriage, which we have seen in this country, huge, tremendous changes and oftentimes not continuous changes on this topic. And so a cast of thousands had like a short paper on that in Science, Social Norms as Solutions, but it's basically just a call to action. And it's a call to action that Simon Levin and his group and my own group have sort of taken to heart. And so we've developed this, again, working group that looks at both data, generating data, but also sort of creating simulation models that might tell us what are the critical levers we can pull to create these virtuous cycles, to change norms as a way of tipping points for more environmentally conscious and responsible behavior. And I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but basically sort of there are these different actors. We have institutions who issue norms on an issue. We have agents, individual agents who have opinions on these things. The agents interact with each other. The agents also interact with the institutions because the institutions form their identity. If you belong to institution C, D, and E, you are some kind of person. If you belong to A and Z, you're a different type of person. And we care about identity, as I said before. And these things interact. So basically, the institutional norms influence our opinions, but also the people around us and their beliefs and their membership to these different institutions inform our opinions. And so we are social networks, and we break our ties to neighbors as a function of sort of how similar they are to us. And so, of course, this is a complex adaptive system, so you can sort of run through these different iterations. And after a while, you see sort of to what extent behavior, in this case, just opinion, to which case opinion changes, or to which groups diverge in their opinion or converge in their opinions. And then the question is, well, what factors sort of get us to these critical transition-like behaviors that might might be the starting points of tipping points, and there are a few of those, but certainly the speed of norm change, if norms change slowly, that's more conducive to creating tipping points than when norms change very quickly. So again, this is very much work in progress, but very interesting. So we're getting close to the end, just a few more slides. And so let me talk about one other feature of Homo sapiens, which is the fact that we learn. Of course, economic behavior, economic rational models. Let's look at behavior sort of at the end of learning, right? Steady state kind of behaviors. But learning matters. And there's reinforcement learning in the 1960s. There's social learning and imitation. And the question is, does learning matter in the real world? And so I want to just show you one other quick study. It goes a while back, my research group at Columbia a few years ago, where we basically looked at the distinction between fluid and crystallized intelligence. This basic fluid intelligence relates to how quickly we can process information logically, sort of processing speed, consistency in our types of decisions. Whereas crystallized intelligence is the residue of lifelong learning. The kinds of norms that we abstract, the kinds of values that we abstract, the kinds of instances we remember that we might recall at the time of decision. So there are very different types of ability. And they map to some extent on calculation-based decisions, because calculation-based decisions require fluid intelligence. They require processing speed, and they require clearness of mind. And rule and norm-based decisions require that we actually have acquired norms. We have to know what people like us do in these types of situations, and which of these behaviors have had good consequences and which of them have had bad consequences. So trial and error learning and its residue. And so this paper that came out a few years ago, actually just a couple of years ago, 3 years ago in PNAS, but it was like 2 or 3 years of work, where we looked at Americans across the lifespan. And as it turns out, you lose fluid intelligence very quickly. Almost everybody in this room is on a downward slope. And some more than others. And so those are the black lines. And of course, that bodes not well if we make decisions rationally, right? Because if that ability rapidly declines, that's not good news. It's also not good news because the people at the lower end of fluid intelligence have the most money to manage. So it's not good for the national economy either. However, here comes fluid intelligence to the rescue. So the green line, in this case, this is like measured by a vocabulary test, but it can be measured in many different ways. But not surprisingly, crystallized intelligence, which is acquired by lifelong learning, increases over your lifespan. And the question is, can these decreases in fluid intelligence be offset by increases in crystallized intelligence? And so we did this large structural equation modeling that basically showed that yes, indeed, sort of as people get older, they get less good on fluid intelligence, but much better at crystallized intelligence. And those increases sort of completely offset the possible discrepancies or decreases due to fluid intelligence. So in the end, people, and this includes actually real-world FICO scores, people in this old age brackets did just as well or better managing their money than people in their 20s. Okay. And so when it comes down to dynamics, there are other models available other than psychological models, complex adaptive systems, social network influence, and social media models. And we basically want to put all of these together. So let me just sort of highlight some of the problems with the current theory, behavioral theory, decision theory landscape that I sort of showed you in the last 20 minutes or so. Is that when it comes to network models, complex adaptive systems models, the nodes themselves are pretty stupid. The nodes sort of pass on information. They pass or don't pass on information. They might break a tie with a neighbor, but they're not very complex information processors. And when it comes to the behavioral models, basically they miss the complete class of influences of the social and the physical environment. They're very much individualistic models, just in your brain. They're also fragmented over subdisciplines, and oftentimes sort of focus on very specific aspects of decision making. There's sort of no cross-cutting models. And oftentimes they're verbal models. They don't have a mathematical form to implement them. That doesn't make it very applicable. And so enters MoHuB, Models of Human Behavior. And as I mentioned before, Simon Levin was kind enough to introduce me to Maya Schluter, who led this initial effort at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. They basically surveyed sort of the existing set of behavioral models and tried to put it into an agent-based framework that could implement these different components, but implement them all at the same time to different degrees, depending on what was required for the decision in the social ecological systems, in their case mostly fisheries and the Baltic. But I think one of the problems was that they didn't have a psychologist on the team. So they basically sort of had sampled models by doing literature reviews or asking people to nominate their favorite models. It wasn't very comprehensive. So we recently joined forces with them and now sort of are working on MoHuB 2.0. Where we have a broader sort of set of psychological theories. But here's our mantra: as complex as necessary, but as simple as possible. And of course, expected utility theory as a rational choice is sort of in many ways sort of the simplest example of models in that class. But it's only a special case. And the question is, how much do you have to sort of complicate the picture to explain the behaviors that are anomalies with respect to the rational model? And then program them as an agent-based toolbox that anybody could be using to see what differences does it make if you make these assumptions as opposed to these assumptions. And so this is what it looks like. So basically, we still have these network models, but now each node, each agent actually is much more complex psychologically than he or she was before. Okay, so basically in closing, I want to argue that as we think about behavior in the Anthropocene, behavior with respect to energy that affects our living environment, life on our planet, probably should be modeled more with bounded rationality, with complete rationality as a special case. Homo sapiens rather than Homo economicus, because it leads to better forecasts, it leads to better policy or policy implementation, and hopefully also more action. And let me just thank you for your very scarce attention, and also my collaborators and our funding agencies. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions.
Thanks for the great talk. So I'm interested in the result you showed that when local temperatures are warmer, people have greater belief in global warming, because I'm a climate scientist myself, and I've been troubled when I interact with people and they say, oh yeah, the temperatures have been so warm recently, or oh, after Sandy, clearly I believe in global warming. To what degree I should correct them or not? Because I'm worried there'll be a follow-on effect where, say, they experience Superstorm Sandy and we don't have any tropical cyclones for a few years. Is that gonna, will the effect of believing in global warming and then being like, wait, there are no tropical cyclones, then will they really firmly not believe anything we say anymore? So I don't know. I was wondering.
It's a great question, and in some sense it gets us different goals that we have, right? We have different goals sort of as a scientist. We want to educate people in the truth and the truth underlying mechanisms. As an activist, you might want to get some action, and maybe sort of rectifying a mistake could backfire. And the way I think about it is that education, of course, is probably of primary importance. Because if you don't educate people about the correct underlying mechanisms, you might have an advantage today, but tomorrow when it snows, we'll throw snowballs at Al Gore, and so it backfires anyway. But the other thing is also if you're a policymaker and there's some policy you can push through, think about doing that at the time when public opinion actually is behind you because of recent extreme events. You don't have to necessarily tell people that it's right or wrong, but you utilize the positive energy, the political will towards the issue. But make sure that sort of you have these policies in your back pocket and wait for the right kind of moment to release even with the paper or to release a policy at the right time.
I just want to know that do you feel that over the years now the efficiency of behavioral science would increase or decrease as people become more aware of the default options and the methods which they are getting from the surroundings?
Yeah, so the question was, do I think that the awareness and the use of behavioral sciences has increased in the last little while? And certainly if you look at sort of the publications of popular books on the topic, it's huge. They're also being used, behavioral science tools are being used in behavioral insights teams around the world. I think last time I counted, there were like over 25 national teams, but they also happen at the city level, at the state level. Companies now have behavioral insights teams. There's no question that on the one hand, I think sort of people are generally more aware of them, and also they're more interested in them because they oftentimes see that there's very little that you need to do, and it has great effects. Now, it's not a panacea. Yeah, I mean, oftentimes it's changing behavior at the margin. But the other good news is it's also not a sledgehammer. Yeah, and so oftentimes sort of people talk about not wanting or foes of behavioral. The use of behavioral insights oftentimes talk about brainwashing people into doing what they don't want to do or tricking people into things that are not in their best interest. Turns out it's not so easy. Yeah? And if you look at the kind of studies that even the ones I showed you, where you increase by making organ donation the default option, as opposed to not being an organ donor, it changes behavior maybe by 20 or 30%, but not everybody does it. Yeah? And it turns out that nudges or default options oftentimes are more signposts. They remind us of goals that we have and the fact that we have them, and they're priming the relevant goals if you have them. But if you don't have that goal, then nothing gets primed. So I think this is a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think the answer is yes.
Thank you. Quick question. I mean, it seems like sort of part of this project is trying to figure out, why aren't we doing anything?
Right.
There's a really big problem. It seems like nothing's happening.
Right.
And I think the previous work, to summarize, was sort of, well, people are ignorant or superstitious and they can't understand the complexity of the problem. Mm-hmm. This is a great improvement on that. Right? That actually it might be our models can't actually account for the complex ways that people make decisions. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, I think there's a third influence out there that we have to account for, which is the massive investment in uncertainty.
Oh, sure.
At this moment. And this model seems really elegant if it's innocent of our current politics.
Right.
And once we introduce that messy, nasty,
sure.
interested politics into it, I wonder how the model can account for, the huge investments in maintaining uncertainty we have.
Yeah, so it's a great point. And so basically, you've seen a small slice. So basically, it's Rob Sokolow wedges approach, right? So behavioral science is a wedge, but there are, first of all, many other behavioral sciences that we should be including in the IPCC process. For example, more political science, sort of more sociology. But it's only one of the wedges. And also climate change under appreciation or climate change denial comes in very different flavors. And so what you're pointing to is willful distortion, the merchants of doubt. That's a very rational response to sort of somebody who has stranded assets, right? I mean, there's nothing irrational about that. And of course, it has unintended consequences and it muddles the landscape. But I think one thing that's important is to sort of not put everybody in the same bucket. Climate change denials comes in probably in 5 or 6 or 7 different flavors. And again, if you're trying to do something about it, you have to know what are those buckets and what motivates people in these different buckets. And some of them will be entirely rational, and some of them will have to do with our bounded rationality. But once you know what's causing it, then the prescriptions will be very different for bucket 1 and bucket 2.
Other questions? Going once, going twice.
Strategies with respect to how we can shape the order of the choices. Status quo is normally the first option to revert. That happens with climate, right? 17 or 18 they don't want to think about it. One more complexity. The status quo seems to be all right for them. So how do we change that? How can we all make a political strategy that uses insight about
Yeah. So an important question, and I think there's sort of two answers to that. I think sort of the answer you're looking for is sort of how to change, how to reframe choices to the general public in such a way that sort of well, they will be more likely to do the thing that's in their own long-term interest. But another answer to that, and there, of course, I think sort of some of the examples I already gave, sort of are important. Labeling, I mean, a carbon dividend is a lot better than a carbon tax. Dividend means you're getting money back. But I think the other answer maybe to your question is that sort of we should think about, we should re-examine what we mean by paternalism. Paternalism doesn't have to be a dirty word. It has become a dirty word because of our political ideology about sort of decision autonomy. But let me actually sort of just quickly step forward to a couple of what I call bold policies. Mayor Bloomberg in 2002 introduced a smoking ban in bars and restaurants in New York City against huge public opposition because the status quo was that you could smoke when you went to drink, and people sort of didn't like to give up on that. Similarly, in British Columbia, the premier introduced one of the early carbon taxes in 2008, again against huge public opposition and companies were going to be non-competitive in British Columbia. And in both cases, these policymakers said, "Look, I've done my rational analysis. My experts telling me this is improving public good, and you will like it afterwards." It was basically a paternalistic response to that didn't go over very well. And so we did a media analysis of both of these events. At the time of announcement, public opinion, this is measured by just sort of articles in the 3 daily newspapers in each city. Public opinion goes way south. Public sentiment goes way south. Lots of attacks on that. It bottoms out at implementation. And then the question is, how long does it take before public opinion becomes positive again? Does it become positive again, and how long does it take? And why would it become positive? Well, first of all, if it does improve public welfare, if you're paternalistic and say, you're going to like me for this when you grow up, I'm going to tell you now what to eat and what not to eat. People, if it does improve their public welfare, they will experience those consequences, positive consequences, and that will be feedback. They might not have thought about them ex ante because of curiosity, but they will experience them. The other thing is the hated new thing that nobody thought of before will become the law of the land, and therefore will become the new status quo. And after a while, people will automatically think about it first because it has become the status quo. The only question is, if you're an elected official, how long does that process take? Will you be thrown out of office in the meantime or not? And we're in the process of actually doing a more comprehensive analysis of these kinds of situations. But in one case, it was 9 months. In the other case, it was 15 months. You see very similar sort of sentiment dynamics here. And so well within the re-election cycle of public officials. So I think sort of one thing we might want to remind our elected officials of is that we have politicians because we want them to do our long-term strategic planning for us, because we have neither the interest nor the energy or the information to do that, and paternalism doesn't have to be a dirty word.
This has been a fantastic. Thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask your thoughts on framing in terms of positives and gains compared to negatives and losses. There's this what you're talking about in terms of people responding very strongly against wanting to lose things, so loss aversion, but also being much more risk-seeking when it comes to losses. So there's uncertainty, being much more willing to just take the chance that the loss won't be as bad. And there's a lot of, I'd basically like to hear your comment on framing things like climate change and biodiversity loss, these really huge, overwhelming things. Huge losses that people can tend to shut down faced with such a big negative and a loss, compared to some evidence that framing things in terms of that loss can actually encourage
get their attention.
Yeah.
Now, your question very nicely demonstrates the complexity and the sometimes annoying complexity that behavioral science introduces into making predictions what's going to happen when you change a policy or when you have even a certain communication framework. Because with Homo economicus, we know there's one answer to the question. With behavioral science theories, there oftentimes are 3 or 4 or 5 different answers because different phenomena all play a role, maybe to different degrees. Maybe loss aversion is more important here, but risk aversion is more important there, or the emotional impact of getting people's attention because it's negative and because and loss aversion is good. But on the other hand, also nobody likes to be in this negative mood state for very long. So unless there's a simple answer to how to get out of that state, people will turn away. I think that introduces like tremendous complexity, and that's why these kind of behavioral interventions, how to frame something, how to message, positive versus negative messaging, what kind of label to use, have to be absolutely tested, field tested, because you might have some prediction ex ante, but sort of what factors will be most important, but it will be probably different for different groups and different subgroups in your sample, and I think that's why doing A/B testing of these different formats, you might have some predictions, but make sure you test those predictions before you roll it out on the larger scale. Because you're absolutely right. Oftentimes, predictions go in opposite directions. Yeah, David.
A follow-up to this question. Does loss aversion mean that a negative campaign, which is inherently built on loss, you'll lose your health care, you'll lose your job, does that mean that that type of campaign is inherently more resonant, more powerful than sort of a positive, hopefully changing kind of campaign?
It is in terms of getting initial attention, and therefore it's quite useful. For example, like in the health domain, if you sort of scare people into getting like an exam, a diagnostic exam, because it's motivating to sort of think about you might be losing your health, and if there's a simple thing you can do to fix that, you will do that. The problem comes in when you use negative messaging and negative campaigns for behaviors that require sustained attention over time. Or if it becomes so negative that it's just sort of so overwhelming, it's a little bit like thinking about your death. I mean, most of us realize we're dying, but it's a very intellectual level. Like we don't truly believe we're dying until we get a little older. And it's probably perfectly sensible. It might not be rational, but perfectly sensible to put thoughts about death out of your mind. I think oftentimes things that sort of thinking or not thinking about death is the closest analogy we have with respect to climate change, because again, it's such an existential loss, and it's such a huge problem, and there's so little we can do as an individual to solve it, that it's probably quite functional to just sort of turn away. And we all do it to different degrees, and so one implication, of course, of that answer is that we have to work on messaging that effective solutions exist, and that solutions that seem like a drop in the bucket at an individual level or at a group level, if you multiply them by the right number of instances, actually can work, and that they can work together. But they have to work together oftentimes in a coordinated fashion. And that's why we get into political science, how to get the coordination that we need across all these different levels, so to bring about solutions that actually will work rather than being futile.
One last question.
Yeah, I think it's very important to keep in mind that we really have a bimodal distribution at this point. Polling that's been done over the last couple of years, in particular, one that was done in mid-October, right before the IPCC 1.5 report came out, showed that for voters who identify as Democrats, they're now saying that climate is not 17th or 18th, they're saying it's 4th, just behind health, guns, and the income gaps. Right. So you've got a 61-point difference in between Republican and Democratic respondents in terms of whether climate is a big problem.
Yeah.
Probably yes, which way it's going. So I do think it's absolutely imperative to be thinking about which of those two audiences are you trying to engage at any given point. Are you trying to actually move the people who I would assert are the ones who at this point need to be moved, which are the ones who are blocking progress on climate, as opposed to continuing to reinforce concern among the folks who are already there.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and think sort of messaging to subgroups is important. I think the other sort of great takeaway is that we have to find a way of maybe depoliticizing action on climate change. Because it yeah, please.
On that would be how do we get Fox News to quit lying?
Yeah.
What's happening is you're seeing continual reinforcement of erroneous messages from conservative media elites. That I think is a big chunk of the problem. What do we do about it?
Yeah, well, if I had the answer to that, I wouldn't be standing here.
On that note, let's go. Please don't forget to clean up after yourselves. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That was a lot of fun.
Which is that I was wondering how robust these models are to the definition of agency is that in some context